Learn grammar, active and passive voice. Active voice. When the verb speaks of its subject as acting, it is said to be in the active voice. Examples: the shopkeeper sold all the cakes. Here the verb sold is highlighted. The verb speaks of its subject. The subject is shopkeeper as doing some action. The shopkeeper sells. The shopkeeper sold all the cakes. So here this is in the active voice. David drinks milk every day. This verb drinks, it speaks of the subject as active. Therefore, this verb drinks is in the active voice. Paul will buy a new watch. The verb will buy speaks of its subject as acting, speaks of Paul as doing some action of buying. So Paul will buy a new watch. So all these three examples, they are in the active voice. The shopkeeper sold all the cakes. David drinks milk every day. Paul will buy a new watch. Passive voice. When the verb speaks of its subject of being acted upon or having something done to it, the verb is said to be in the passive voice. Examples: all the cakes were sold by the shopkeeper. So here, were sold, the verb speaks of its subject as being acted upon or something done to it. The cakes were sold. So therefore, this verb is in the passive voice, or this sentence is in the passive voice. The cat was killed by the wolf. Here, was killed is highlighted. This verb speaks of its subject as having something done to it. So the cat, something was done to the cat. It was killed. So was killed, the verb is in the passive voice, or this sentence is in the passive voice. A birthday party will be arranged next week. So here, will be arranged, this verb speaks of the subject as something done to it. The party will be arranged. So will be arranged is in the passive voice, or the sentence a birthday party will be arranged next week is in the passive voice. Let us understand the rules for changing the voice. While changing from active to passive voice, the following changes take place in the subject, verb plus object pattern. The object of the active voice is changed into the subject in the passive voice. The subject of the active voice is changed into object in the passive preceding by. After the subject, use the proper be form according to the tense and the number of the subject. Note, the tense has to be maintained. Be form in the present, am, is, are. Be form in the past, was, were. Let's understand these rules with the help of an example. The wolf killed the cat. So we see that while changing from active to passive voice, there are certain changes in this subject verb object pattern. The wolf is the subject, the verb is kill, and the cat is the object. So while changing it into the passive voice, the object, that is the cat, becomes the subject, you see over here, and the subject of the active voice, that is the wolf, is changed into the object over here in the passive preceding by. You see this by. So the cat was killed by the wolf. This is in the passive voice. So this sentence, the wolf killed the cat, is in the active voice. So what is the rule? That the object becomes the subject in the passive. The subject of the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. The meaning of preceding is it comes before, precedes it. After the subject, that is when the subject here in the passive voice, you use the be form. Now what is the be form in the present? Am, is, are. What is the be form in the past? Was, were. So we have to use the be form according to the tense and the number of the subject. the tense has to be maintained. So you have to see what the tense is. The wolf killed the cat. So this is in the past tense. Therefore, you will use the be form in the past only. Was or were. You have to use it as per the number of the subject. If the subject is singular, it will be was. If it was cats, it would be were. But here the subject is singular. The cat was killed by the wolf. Now this verb killed is actually the past participle. I'll explain to you in the next slides. So this killed is in the past tense, but here was killed. Here this becomes the past participle. Transformation of sentence, voice change. Simple present tense. The form of the simple present tense, subject, verb in the present, and object. That's the active voice. Look at this sentence. Tom writes a letter. So this sentence is in the active voice. Subject, verb in the present, and object. We have to change this into the passive voice. We know what the rule is. The object becomes the subject, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. You have to use the be form in the present. What are the be forms in the present? Am, are, and is. So you will use is. Why is? Because the subject is singular. A letter is written. Written is the past participle. By Tom. So a letter is written by Tom. This is in the passive voice. This is the form. Subject, am, are, is, and the past participle. The next example, Jane washes the dishes. This is in the active voice. In the passive voice, the object, the dishes, becomes the subject. The subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Again, the be form in the present, am, are, is. You use are because the subject is plural. The dishes are washed. Washed is the past participle. The dishes are washed by Jane. So this is in the passive voice. Let's go through the form in the passive voice. For simple present tense, subject, am, are, or is, plus the past participle. Present continuous tense. The form of the present continuous tense, subject, am, are, is, that is the be form, plus the ing form of the verb. The example, Tom is writing a letter. This is in the active voice, present continuous tense. We have to change it into the passive voice. We know what the rule is. The object in the active voice becomes the subject. The subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will use the be form, am, are, or is. So here we'll use is. A letter is. Then you will write being written, the past participle, by Tom. Look at the form of the passive voice in the present continuous tense, subject, am, are, is, plus being, plus the past participle. The next example, Jane is washing the dishes, active voice. We know that the object in the active voice becomes the subject, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive preceding by. You'll use the be form in the present, am, are, is. You will use are here because here the subject is plural. So the dishes are being washed by Jane. So this is the form of the passive voice in the present continuous tense. Subject, am, are, or is, plus being, plus the past participle. This is the past participle here, washed. Present perfect tense. The form of the present perfect tense, subject, has or have, plus the past participle, active voice. Look at the following sentence. Tom has written a letter. This is in the active voice. Subject, Tom, has, written is the past participle, and this is the object. we have to change this into the passive voice. So the object in the active voice becomes the subject in the passive voice, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will write has, been, and the past participle. Look at the form of the passive voice in the present perfect tense: subject, has or have, been, and the past participle. So the sentence in the passive voice: a letter has been written by Tom. The next example: Jane has washed the dishes. This is in the active voice. See, subject, has, this is the past participle, and this is the object. The object in the active voice becomes the subject in the passive voice, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will use have, the dishes have been, and washed here is the past participle, by Jane. The dishes have been washed by Jane. This is in the passive voice. So look at the form of the passive voice in the present perfect tense: subject, has or have, been, and the past participle. Note, present perfect continuous tense has no passive voice. Past tense. Simple past tense. The form of the simple past tense is subject and verb in the past. Look at the example. Tom wrote a letter. This is in the active voice. Subject Tom, wrote, verb in the past, and this is the object. Now we have to change this into the passive voice. So we know that the object in the active voice becomes the subject in the passive, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will use the be form in the past. What is the be form in the past? Was or were. So you will use was. Why? Because a letter was, it is singular. The subject here is singular. A letter was written by Tom. Written is the past participle. The next example: Jane washed the dishes. This is in the active voice. Jane is the subject. Washed is the verb in the past, and this is the object. We have to change this into the passive voice. So the dishes, the object, becomes the subject in the passive voice, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you'll use the be form in the past. So we'll use were. Why? Because here the dishes is plural. So the dishes were washed by Jane. Now this washed here in the passive voice is the past participle. So the form of the passive voice, simple past tense, is subject, was or were, that is the be form in the past, and the past participle. Past continuous tense. The form of the past continuous tense: subject, was, were, plus ing form of the verb. Look at the sentence: Tom was writing a letter. So Tom is the subject, was the be form in the past, and this is the ing form of the verb, that is writing. A letter is the object. So this is in the active voice. We have to change this into the passive voice. So the object, a letter, becomes the subject in the passive voice, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will use the be form, was or were. You'll use was. Why? Because a letter is singular. So it will be a letter was being written by Tom. Look at the form of the past continuous tense passive voice: subject, was, were, that is the be form, being, and the past participle. So was, being, and this is the past participle. Written is the past participle. So a letter was being written by Tom is in the passive voice. The next example: Jane was washing the dishes. This is in the active voice, past continuous tense. We have to change this into the passive voice. So the dishes, the object in the active voice, becomes the subject in the passive, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will use were. Why were? Because here the subject, the dishes, is plural. Then you're going to use being, and this washed here is the past participle. So the dishes were being washed by Jane is in the passive voice, past continuous tense. Past perfect tense. The form of the past perfect tense, subject, had, and the past participle, active voice. Look at this sentence. Tom had written a letter. This is in the active voice. Tom is the subject, had, and here written is the past participle and the object. We have to change this into the passive voice. So the object in the active voice becomes the subject, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will write had, been, and the past participle. So look at this form. Subject, had, been, and the past participle. This is the form of the passive voice, past perfect tense. So the sentence, a letter had been written by Tom. The next sentence, Jane had washed the dishes. This is in the active voice. Subject, had, and the past participle. Subject, had, and this is the past participle. The dishes is the object. Active voice. The object in the active voice becomes the subject. So the dishes. And the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive preceding by. Then you will use had, been, and the past participle. See here, had, been, and this washed is the past participle. So the sentence in the passive voice, the dishes had been washed by Jane. Let's go through the form of the past perfect tense, passive voice, subject, had, been, and the past participle. Note, past perfect continuous tense has no passive voice. Simple future tense. The form of the simple future tense, subject, will or shall, and the root verb or the main verb. Look at this sentence. Tom will write a letter. Active voice. So Tom is the subject, will, write is the root verb or the main verb, and or letter is the object. We have to change this into the passive voice. We know what the rule is. The object in the active voice becomes the subject. So here a letter is the subject, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will write will and be, and this is the past participle written. See the form of the passive voice, simple future tense, subject, will, be, and the past participle. So the sentence, a letter will be written by Tom. This is in the passive voice. Let's do another example. Jane will wash the dishes. Active voice. Jane is the subject, will, wash is the root verb, and the dishes is the object. The object in the active voice becomes the subject in the passive, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive preceding by. Then you will use will, be, and this washed is a past participle. So the sentence in the passive voice, the dishes will be washed by Jane. Let's go through the form of the passive voice, simple future tense, subject, will, be, and the past participle. Future perfect tense. The form of the future perfect tense, subject, will or shall, have, and the past participle, active voice. Look at this sentence. Tom will have written a letter. This is in the active voice. Subject is Tom, will, have, and written is the past participle, and a letter is the object. We have to change this into the passive voice. So the object in the active voice becomes the subject in the passive voice, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will use will, have, been, and the past participle that is written. Look at the form of the passive voice, subject, will or shall, have, been, and the past participle. So the sentence in the passive voice will be, a letter will have been written by Tom. Take the next example. Jane will have washed the dishes. This is in the active voice. Subject, Jane, will, have, and washed is the past participle, and the dishes is the object. We have to change this into the passive voice. So the dishes, the object in the active voice, becomes the subject in the passive voice, and the subject in the active voice becomes the object in the passive voice preceding by. Then you will use will, have, been, and the past participle that is washed. So the sentence is, the dishes will have been washed by Jane. Let's go through the form again. In the passive voice, future perfect tense, subject, will or shall, have, been, and the past participle. Note, the future continuous and the future perfect continuous tense has no passive voice. Interrogative sentences. While changing from active to passive voice in interrogative sentences, note the following changes to be made. Who changes to by whom. Look at the following example. Who repaired the oven? It's an interrogative sentence, active voice. We have to change this into the passive voice. So the passive voice of who repaired the oven is by whom was the oven repaired. Look at the form of this passive voice. It's the question word whom, the auxiliary verb was, or you can say it is the be form of the past tense, was or were. So you have to use was. The oven becomes the subject, the object becomes the subject, and repaired is the past participle. Another example, will you wash these dishes? Question mark. This is an interrogative sentence, active voice. In the passive voice, the sentence will be, will these dishes be washed by you? So will is the question word, these dishes is the subject, be remains be, washed is the past participle. Imperative sentences. Imperative sentences are sentences with a command or a request. When an imperative command is to be transformed into the passive voice, the form will be, so this is the form of an imperative command which is changed into the passive voice. So let subject be and the past participle. Look at this example, cut the ribbon. So this is an imperative command. It's an imperative sentence. It's in the active voice. We have to make this into the passive voice. So this is the form. Let subject be and the past participle. So you'll use let. The object, the ribbon, now will become the subject. You use be and cut here is the past participle. The next example, give the order. This is in the active voice. It is an imperative sentence. So again in the passive voice, it will be let. This the order which is here, the object becomes the subject. So let the order be given. Here given is the past participle of give. Read this. Let this be read. So let this is the subject here, be, and read here is the past participle. This is read. Read this. Here this is read. It's the past participle. So let this be read. This is in the passive voice. Let's do the following exercise. Change to passive voice. The first sentence, the cat chased away all the rats and mice. This is in the active. We have to change it into the passive voice. All the rats and mice were chased away by the cat. So all the rats and mice, which is the object, becomes the subject. You will use the be form in the past because it is chased away. So be form in the past is was or were. You will use were because rats and mice, it's the plural. Were chased. Here chased is the past participle, away by the cat. Cat, here the subject in the active voice becomes the object preceding by. The next example, smoke filled the attic, active voice. Subject, verb in the past, and the attic is the object. We have to change this into the passive voice. The attic becomes the subject. Then since filled, it is in the past tense, simple past tense. So you'll use the be form in the past. So you'll use was. Why was? Because the attic is singular. So the attic was filled with smoke. Here filled is the past participle. And this smoke, which was the subject in the active voice, becomes the object in the passive voice. You have kindled in them a desire to excel. This is in the active voice. So in the passive voice, a desire to excel now becomes the subject. Now, have kindled will become has been kindled. That's in the passive voice. In them by you. So you, which is the subject here, has become the object preceding by. I am building this bridge for him, active voice. The tense is the present continuous tense. So in the passive voice, it is this bridge here, which is the object, becomes the subject. Since it is in the present continuous, you will use the be form in the present, that is am, are, is. The bridge is. Singular subject. The bridge is. Then you will use being built. Here built is the past participle. Built for him. Summon Tenali Raman at once. Active voice. This is the imperative command or the imperative sentence. So in the passive voice it will be let Tenali Raman be summoned at once. We know it is let, subject, be, and the past participle. How can I discuss its merit? This is the active voice. It's an interrogative sentence. So in the passive voice, how can its merits be discussed? Let's do another exercise. Change to active voice. The first sentence, he was invited to the palace. This is in the passive voice. We have to change it into the active voice. Now you have to supply the agent or the doer of the action over here. So I have taken it as the king. So the king invited him to the palace. The second sentence, more food was laid out. It is by them. So you have to supply the agent. So in the active voice, you will say they laid out more food. More food was laid out by them. That's the passive voice. So in the active voice, you will say they laid out more food. The third sentence, Lantoy has been fascinated by the stories of pioneer women. So this is in the passive voice. The active voice, the stories of pioneer women have fascinated Lantoy. Doors were yanked open by the police. This is in the passive voice. The active voice is the police yanked open the doors.